So yeah, I've been working for the past 3 years as innovation advisor in the African region for Tunis, covering around 10 different country offices there. And the majority of the countries where we work are countries that have very low and weak infrastructure and a lot of issues related to either political violence or a lot of issues related to access to the actual infrastructure itself. So what I want to talk about is three main things that I see when looking at access and affordability of internet, and touch just a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about freedom online. And one of the main things that I would like to talk about is the infrastructural issues. As my colleague was talking about, there was a lot of buzz and a lot of excitement when the submarine cable was built all around the African continent, and lots of countries that before didn't have any access now have access to the internet. One of the, if you want, maybe undesired effect of that, though, is that the cables goes under the sea, and so it touches on all the countries that have access to the coast. What it happens is that the countries that are internally, that do not have access to the coast, and I'm talking about, for example, DRC, I'm talking about Central African Republic, I'm talking about Chad, for example, they can only access the internet by going through their neighborhood. So they can only access the internet through the connection coming from the countries that have access to the coast. That means that the cost for them to actually access that internet is much higher. But it also means that the keys for their access is actually held by another country. And this is not only creating issues in terms of businesses setting up an infrastructure in those countries because the cost is higher. It's also setting up political issues as related to the relationship in between those countries. The other thing that is also related to that is that for many years, I think that a lot of countries in the international community have not been looking at the issues of licensing and who's actually building those infrastructures in a lot of African countries. And what I've seen in my experience is that China has been a huge player in that field. China has come big time in the African continent, building infrastructure, working directly with governments, and building actually infrastructure at a very reasonable price. What is happening right now, though, is that China is actually winning a lot of bet in a lot of African countries in terms of holding the keys to licensing people to actually use that infrastructure. And while this on one side it's a free market, they have affordable prices, and so they get an advantage when they actually go and deal with governments about this. We have to think about the fact that China is not actually the perfect and best example of freedom online. And so we will need to actually have to deal with this. And in terms of policies, what are the actual things that we need to start thinking about when we have countries where the entire country in terms of licensing, for example, for the digital value for radio stations, for example, it's entirely owned by a Chinese company. On the other side, there's a lot of incredible projects that have been set up, for example, by USA in collaboration with Vodafone in the DRC, or the new project now set up by Google, which I think it's called, Project Loon, in terms of providing connectivity to underserved communities, specifically in rural areas or in areas where there's a problem in actual physical access. And while on one side those projects are amazing, they are actually providing connectivities, like for example in areas in the DRC where it's not even physically possible to go there because of clashes happening between different rebel groups. On the other side, I think that we should push for more investments from side of governments and businesses in actually providing infrastructures in those areas. I remember being in Central African Republic and going to talk to Orange there and asking them and telling them, the country is 30% of Central African Republic is covered with mobile and internet network. Only 30%. 70% of the country doesn't have anything. There's no mobile coverage, there's no internet connection anywhere. When talking with them and asking them, what can we do? And their answer was very simple. From a business point of view, there's no advantage for us in doing that. We need 9 days of travel to go from one city to another one, and then we need a lot of money to set it up there, and a lot of security issues and security measures to secure the location where we put out the tower. And then we need a lot of money to bring the fuel there for the generator to actually make the tower work. Why would I do that? I don't even know if there's a market there. So in that sense, I do think that there is a role in the international international community and with governments to actually work better with businesses and with organizations like Google and Vodafone in trying to set up more sustainable and long-term solutions. Because cheap, fast solutions may work now, but they're not going to build the infrastructure that we will need in 10 years from now. And they're not going to build the market in that area that may push more companies to actually go there and build that infrastructure. Now, on the side of access, though, we go on to a completely different issues. So we can reach a point in which we build a great infrastructure and everybody has access to the internet. On the other side is there content for that on the internet? Is there anything that they can find there? In a lot of the countries where I work in the African continent, people speak local languages. They may be English the main language, they may be French the main language. Still, the majority of the people in underserved areas, in the rural areas, those people that will take the biggest advantage of actually accessing the internet, they will never find any content in their language on the internet. They will find things that are written down, and the majority of them may actually not have a very high literacy rate. They find things that are predominantly in English, maybe in French, but not in their local dialect. And so we can give everybody the internet, but if there's nothing for them there, then why they should use it? What is the advantage what is that we are providing to them? On the other side, again, when we are thinking and talking about policies, we also need to. I think that there is a great opportunity that we need to make sure we're not missing. There are countries in the African continent. I'm thinking specifically, for example, in South Sudan, but I'm also thinking in DRC. I'm thinking the Central African Republic. I'm thinking in Ghana. There is almost no policy in those countries that's related to online, freedom online, and censorship. Those countries are either in the stage in which they are building it right now, because they're getting right now the infrastructure, or they are in a situation where it's far ahead. But they will have to do it. Working right now with those governments and with those countries in trying to share best practices and involve them in the discussion about freedom online, I think it's something that needs to start right now. Actually, probably we need to start yesterday. But we need to think about this, and we need to start working more with those countries that are right now trying to develop those policies. And those policies need to be localized. We cannot think about taking policies from other parts or countries and just replicate them. It doesn't work. Policies can have best practices. We can look at what are the best ones, where they've been working, but they need to be localized. Because each country will have and is building different type of infrastructure. The holistic approach is also looking at how is the old system working, how is the connectivity in between different countries working, how is the connectivity in between different groups in the society working, and look at presence online. The last thing that I just want to point out is slightly related to the old issues that we have been discussing here a lot, which is the issue of security and online freedom in itself. What I have seen in a lot of places where I've worked on is that for a lot of organizations, small organizations working with journalists or with activists in a lot of countries, and again I'm thinking about Ethiopia, I'm thinking about Central African Republic, I'm thinking about DRC, I'm thinking about Zimbabwe. In a lot of places like this, for an organization, security, it's not a choice. It costs a lot of money to them in terms of resources. It costs time, and even if all the software that we want them to use, like Tor and whatever, are free, it is an investment that they need to do in terms of money. We need to make those tools embedded into the infrastructure that we are providing to them. Because asking to small organizations to secure their entire system, it's not sustainable. They can't do it. For them, it's either the choice: I go online unsafely, or I don't go online, because I don't have the ability to actually set up secure infrastructure by myself. I don't have the money. I don't have the expertise. I don't have the push to do it. And so, again, I do think that there is a great opportunity that we have in terms of looking at what can we already embed in the way government and businesses are operating in those countries, so that we lower the human cost for organizations to actually, use secure systems, and making sure that they are equipped to actually then, talk and do something about censorship, about online speech, and about their ability to actually use the internet freely.
and does a lot of work around online campaigning, especially to get knowledgeable and progressive voices heard on issues of good internet governance. So,
I'll be speaking. I want to share our experience in the last 5 years in the Arab region. We did a lot of work in Lebanon, many Arab region countries where we gave a lot of training on the strategic use of social media, the better use of the internet. And I mean, of course, I agree with a lot of what Anahi says, and I'm gonna show this perspective from the Arab region, which is a much more developed countries than Africa. And I can start by the laws. I mean, in all the Arab region, we don't have yet one law that really protects the rights for users. Like, so far, we still lag from Lebanon to Jordan and to other countries. There's yet, it's all the draft laws, and the problem is like any draft law that comes, it comes really in a bad shape. So like we are in a situation where I know it's needed in Africa, but like the problem is like when you want this government to draft a law, like they're gonna give you a law that to protect them, not to protect the users, and that's really a perspective that we need to change somehow. I don't have the answer for that. I'm trying to get more people engaged in the discussion, to get more people to push for more digitalizing in our region, and that's really one of the main challenges that's happening so far. I mean, I can give you a small example of that. A few days ago in Turkey, and there was a lawyer who were sharing with us a case he was protecting or he was following in Kuwait. And there's a lady who insulted the king in Kuwait and on Twitter, and she got 11 years sentence in jail for like blasphemy online against the prince or the king of Kuwait. Like it's like you look at this. Okay, so if we really want to talk about online freedom and how government should help, we really need to take a step back. I mean, can we really do online freedom without going to offline freedom? And that's really a challenge that we can't really solve in this discussion, but we can push for more discussion about it. That's in terms of the laws that I can see in our region. In terms of access, in terms of infrastructure, I can say that I can also give you a few examples of Lebanon, which is a very small country compared to other countries. For example, in Lebanon, like we still don't have fiber optics to connect all the countries together, and we have the influence of the business and of the marketing on the infrastructure rather than the real world. I can give you an example of that to support what I said is in Beirut, which is the city. Now the government is introducing the 4G connection. While in some places, some villages outside the city, which could be like 100 kilometers or 60 miles far away from the city, they're still using dial-up connections. So there's really no decentralization of the infrastructure in the country. And I can see this pattern happening in many countries in our region, where all the focus will be on the big cities without taking in consideration the outside villages, the small community, in those areas where they can really use internet accessibility and in a way to improve education, economy, and different points. Something else is we are trying to have more people accessing the internet, but and I think this might happen in the next 5 or 10 years, or probably 10 or 15 years. Everybody in the world will be accessing the internet, but like there's a language barrier. Like we don't have, for example, Arabic content in the Arab region. Most of the people they speak the local language. We have something in common in our region, but we're not really pushing towards having more content in Arabic, having more open source in Arabic. Another point is accessing internet in their region might be also dangerous on people, because if someone accesses the internet without really understanding the politics of what he or she is going to say and what is the outcome going to happen from their discussions, and we saw a lot of cases with people who are really basic users and they said the wrong sentence online, or they said something bad against the governor or a politician, and then they end up either in jail or harassed, or really something bad happened to them. 3 weeks ago, there was a lady from south of Lebanon who was talking publicly on Facebook against Hezbollah's interfering in Syria, and then suddenly all the family get threatened to leave the village, and so all these new users online, they really need some raising awareness. They really need some education, some like building capacity. There's really a lot of need on this part still in the Arab region, even though there's a lot of connection in many places. Facebook, Google, they have really good outreach in all the region, but there's really a lot of need for building capacity. That's where I want to end my discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, especially for keeping it short, which will allow for greater audience participation. I have a few questions of my own to ask the panelists, but before I push my questions, I'd like to see if the audience has any questions to ask. Sure, Richard, and then we'll go there. Yeah. And could you please introduce yourself and state which panelists you're addressing the question to?
Richard Allen, Facebook, and the question is, I think it's for all the panelists, but it's particularly get on the point about what is the sustainable model for delivering excellence. And so I guess it seems to me that over 10, 15, 20 years, it is going to be mobile companies in each country. Each country is going to end up with 3 or 4 mobile companies that are going to be the people that deliver sustainable internet access on a commercial model. We may need some short-term things to get that. I'm interested in your reaction to that and what that means if that does become the normal model.
Could we pick up a few questions around first and then get to the answers in the interest of time?
Just when I'm saying that for the access and for the access to mobile network, you say that in the one count, I don't know where, that only the 30% is covered. I think it's a matter of which condition that when you buy your license, you should oblige the operator who is going to buy the license to expect certain condition to cover a certain percentage of the count. For example, in Tunisia, we oblige the operator to, during the first 3 years, to cover at least 95% of the need. And this is condition should be respected to cover the whole country, and that would allow people to be connected to mobile network and voice. This is the first comment. The second comment is concerning that concerning free on the emphasis that depends which the country is doing is best to develop the infrastructure and to allow people to be connected to the internet. The government also they are making many editings, many laws and procedures to internet governance, but the lack in this part is the national content. This most of all the country that the content is really improved. I know here in Tunisia, I think it's 90% or more than 90% of the access is to access to the internet traditional internet sites. So I think the big editor of software and let's say like Google, Microsoft, should help and allow people of developing country, for example, Tunisia, know how to develop the local content in order to reduce this gap between developed and developing content. Thank you.
And the gender inclusion issue.
I had a comment on the access.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Mohammed Taraki, I'm from the Jordan Muslims Association. My comment was basically, I think that governments do have a big role to play in terms of access. I would worry if access was left to private companies, because I see the internet as more of common goods. So leaving it in the hands of private businesses is kind of dangerous. And actually, a positive example is Jordan, where we had a national program to install a partner network, and it actually helped increase penetration. In the past few years now, it's at 70%, and they're still continuing to reach. The plan is to reach every school in Jordan. That was the initial plan. So yeah, I mean, Jordan is relatively small and relatively stable. I don't know how that scales to other countries, especially in Africa. But I think it's something we should promote rather than. And I don't worry about mobile providers because it's a huge invasion of privacy. That's
I will take two more quickly, and then we'll allow the.
Is there a mic?
Okay, then Andrea, and then.
Thanks. Andrea Istermason, I'm from South Africa. I work for international organization called the Association for Progressive Communication. And I just quickly a comment on the access and content diversity and content in local languages. In my experience, when people have access, they create content. And I think that's never underestimate that. I think often developing country governments have this, you need local language content, you need good content, you need useful content. In fact, once people have access, particularly if they have access in schools, institutions, universities, that good content will be created. And also the fun content will stimulate more use and just people connecting with one another. Just more broadly, I felt that, I think that it is still a real challenge, and I think there's a need for governments and other stakeholders to get involved. But I think, what I'd like to hear from you more is what do you see as the entire sort of access ecosystem? So we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about, when you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about spectrum, you're talking about market structure, and I think that comes to your question about the mobile operators. I think yes, I think if market structure is continued and a large development the way it does now, we will all have to depend on internet access on mobile operators, and maybe most people will anyway, but there is an opportunity, particularly with digital migration, for regulators to create opportunities for more diverse market structure. Even now, with something like television, wide space spectrum and Wi-Fi, it's possible to create opportunities for ISPs who are kind of a dying breed, but they're a dying breed partly because of how the market has been allowed or encouraged to develop. So I think there are some quite critical questions, particularly with digital migration, that policymakers and regulators need to think about if they want to diversify. Have the mobiles probably will be the biggest providers, but we need choice. So how can that be incentivized? And then I think we have to also consider universal service funds and how they failed, and maybe whether there's opportunity in using them in a different way. And I think also something else, what do you think are what about commitments on public access, for example? Free access for people who will never be able to afford it. And I think your comments about capacity buildings, can that be built into some kind of public sector supported free access. And then, yes, I think the other thing which I think is still missing is looking at incentivizing as well, sort of support for access in key institutions. And again, I think around content and content creation and cultural content, is there not a way in which governments can incentivize the creation of certain kind of content? So I think I actually feel in general that we've gone back. I think we were at a stronger place and really looking at how governments and regulators can enable affordable access in the sort of kind of midway between liberalization and where we are now than we are now. It feels to me terribly ad hoc at the moment, and I think most African governments are so intimidated by digital migration that they're actually not really able to think about access in a structured way. Sorry, so.
One more question.
Thank you. My name is Hala Salmawi. I work for the library in Alexandria. I'm an intellectual property officer, and at the same time, I'm the project lead for Creative Commons in Egypt. My question for our friend from Lebanon, and it's kind of a comment also about the Arabic content on the internet. I believe there is some Arabic content in the internet, but maybe those who are doing this are not promoting it enough. Because I know that our library is doing a lot of this. It's those digitalization projects that we are doing them with other international partners. Some of them are even with the UNESCO and with the Library of Congress, and some are doing this by ourselves for the classical Arabic books, which are already in the public domain, so we have the right to put them online, and those books are really thousands. Some of them are very valuable Arabic books of the classics. However, maybe we need to do more for promoting those books online, and maybe we need, as Arabs, to meet more often and talk about this and to talk about more projects together. But if we're talking about Arabic content, I believe there are some books and some Arabic contents already, but sorry that we're not promoting this that much.
Excellent. So what we've had a large number of issues being brought up, which I will recapitulate for the benefit of our panelists. And I will also add a few and give them each around 3 minutes to sum up their thoughts on this. So a few of the questions that I had were to do some of them were around the lines of what Henriette had mentioned about what can governments do to reach the goal of universal service, especially when we know that the private sector can only be incentivized insofar as they're profitable. There still will always remain that gap. Okay, so what can governments do to bridge that gap? One possibility is in thinking about laying out both at the both the base in terms of optic fiber, but also having good policies to enable the last mile connectivity and making this open access. Okay, allowing other players also to access these. That's one possibility, but the question also remains, can anything be done at a global level? And we know that the Digital Solidarity Fund of WSIS didn't work out. So any thoughts on that one? Well, already the issue of USOFs have come up, so I'll skip that. And what can we as civil society, as all of us on this panel are, do about promoting better policy? So a few of the things that I thought about, I'll just highlight and see if any of you have comments on that. So we spoke about 4G technologies, but 4G technologies are hampered, as with 3G and other technologies, with patents. Okay, so how do we solve that problem for developing countries which can't afford large patent fees? In India, we're thinking about going in for TD-SCDMA, which is a relatively untested standard, which is being used only in China, but it was created with the express purpose of circumventing patents held by Qualcomm and other companies. Okay, so that's something we need to think about when we're thinking about newer technologies for access, right? Delicensed spectrum for the last and possibly even the middle mile. TV white spaces can help with that. And right now, there's an example that we were talking about earlier amongst ourselves about a company called AirJaldi in India that works only with underserved communities, okay, and uses Wi-Fi to provide them connectivity. It's a for-profit company now. It started off as a non-profit, but and it's sustainable and it's doing quite well as things stand. Okay, so having and the year it started was 2005. Immediately after there was a change in spectrum policy. Okay, a few months after there was a change in spectrum policy. So you can see the importance of policy in spectrum and ISP licensing policies. Okay, so we can see the link between those kinds of policy decisions and the possibilities in terms of market structures. We've spoken about local language, but one thing is local language input, right? If you can't type in the local language effectively, then how do you actually go about that? So so one possibility is moving towards speech to text, right? But apart from that, from what I understand, in the EU, they actually have regulation that requires that the software on phones have a certain number of languages, in them when they're sold in the EU. Not too many other countries have those kinds of requirements in terms of regulation. Search engines, another big area. Software and devices for persons with disabilities. Free and open source software which can encourage localization, and having specific government-funded projects that encourage localization of software, etc. And so I've added a few issues on your plates, and to recap what the audience said about mobile companies being the sustainable model, perhaps for infrastructure to reach out to people. Backhaul issues still remain, but and Andrea added that while doing so, we have to take care of market structures. Telecom licensing as an important issue of how do we incentivize companies to actually provide services to places which are not traditionally profitable. National content, there being insufficient local content, that access will lead to content, and that copyright policies and governmental initiatives through libraries, etc., can lead to increased amount of content. That governments have an important role in infrastructure, and use of and free access were also touched upon. So now, I think, given how late we started, we have overshot our time already, but I'll give each of the speakers around 3 minutes to wrap up your talk.
Thank you very much. That's a long list in 3 minutes, but
it's a good thing I have something to report back now. So thank you all.
I'll just touch upon a few issues that were brought up: the sustainable model, the reason to invest, and also the various aspects to deal with the physical governance and the human infrastructure. On the physical infrastructure and the sustainable model, and you mentioned you have, and we discussed, you have all the submarine cables around the African continent, but also providing connectivity to the Indian subcontinent and the East. You have the submarine cables in the Caribbean as well. Those submarine cables are there now, and they're around the continents. There are also terrestrial fiber networks that bring the accessibility and availability further in. But as you were saying, we need to be more. I think we need to be more daring, more innovative, to see what works and to see how we can bring that accessibility and availability. Like you said, use the white spaces, use the mobile networks in countries where the mobile networks, like the DRC, the mobile networks actually bring much more internet access and availability. So build out those kind of, or have build out for those kind of networks. And that brings me to the point of the Tunisian gentleman. Yes, you can have it in your policy policy framework, in your licensing, in your spectrum policy, where spectrum is a rare economic good, have obligations imposed so that there can be universal access and service coverage. To come to your point, yes, we've tried that, but I think that today, I wouldn't agree with you that we've taken a step back. I think actually by looking at the demand creation, and we've focused a lot on supply for the last decade, the last 2 decades. We've really focused on opening up how do we bring access to the remote, to the rural areas. I think we want to focus even more on the demand creation to say, you say if there is connectivity, there will be local content creation. But I think we need to take it a little step further to encourage people. And you say you're from South Africa. I think one of the fascinating things to promote reading in youth, for example, is the books online or the soaps and the books online for young children, that they can actually add chapters themselves. Some of these programs to enhance demand and thus enhance the need for connectivity, and thus encourage the oranges and such of this world to actually invest in some of these more remote and unserved and underserved areas. By creating demand, you can reach those areas that today or even yesterday, today a bit less, was less necessary or less convincing to invest in. I think that so that demand creation is very important. But within that demand creation, you need the governance framework, so you need the necessary laws and regulations and policy so that you use spectrum effectively, so that people don't hoard spectrum, so that you can have trading of spectrum, so that the white spaces get used effectively, or as you say, that there is unlicensed spectrum as well, so that it's efficient and effective. And I also think you need to focus more on the human framework, in the sense that you develop the content, you develop the policies. You mentioned the laws to protect the people so that people know what they're getting into, the digital rights, to raise awareness on the use of internet. I think they're the multi-stakeholder and the bottom-up approach, not just letting government develop the infrastructure and develop the content, but bringing in other voices for the development of that content and for the rules that govern that content, that helps you get a long way as well. Those are just a few of the points you mentioned, but those are just the points I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, there were really a lot of questions. I can touch a little bit on the issues of access and answer specifically to your questions about, it's, sometimes I look at the kind of like, where are we going to be in 10 years from now? And sometimes I see that future coming. I do think though that we have a lot of instruments to change the way this is going to be designed. Again, on one side, I think that there's a huge role that civil society organizations can play and are playing in a lot of those countries in terms of making sure that they're sitting at the table with governments when certain policies are being designed, making sure that they talk to each other, they share best practices and knowledge, even across boundaries and across organization, to actually make sure that the policies designed that will regulate the way private sector operates in certain countries are actually done according to certain standards and respecting certain freedoms, if you want, right? And I think that, for example, there are good examples of this. We can see, for example, a country like Kenya that has, an incredible infrastructure, and is an infrastructure that also grow in little time. It wasn't 20 years, time in which Kenya actually grew and built a robust infrastructure and a regulation on top of it. It was actually a very short amount of time. But the synergy in between the private sector, the government, who put a lot of effort into actually work on that, and the civil society, actually what was made, I think that was like the biggest achievement in terms of looking at one African country that went from a very low, weak infrastructure and almost no regulation to a robust infrastructure with a strong, or at least a going stronger regulation in terms of access and affordability and use of those ecosystems. So I do think that there's a huge role, and I will point more on the civil society role, the international communities in terms of standards, and the partnerships in between government and businesses. Living the business out and say, oh, the business build the infrastructure and build the business manages it. Yes, it is a matter of business, but it is also again a matter of human rights and right to access certain type of tools. And I think that if we point that direction, we have a great opportunity. Talking about expectations and expecting businesses to actually connect certain countries at a minimum standard. In theory, that's a great idea, and I think it may be possible in certain areas. In other areas, it's structurally impossible. I mean, when we're talking about Central African Republic, we're talking about a country where there are almost no roads. At least 60% of the country is controlled by 4 or 5 different rebel groups. Right now, there's not even a government. So we are talking about structural issues and problems that will make it impossible, to build the infrastructure. And again, I see a strong link in between the actual infrastructure built by the government, roads, electricity, and all these kind of things, and the infrastructure that then can be built by the businesses and by the providers to actually connect those areas, all together. I think that on one side we can say, yeah, it's the business that has to do it. Again, to me, it's hard to differentiate in between one and the other. There must be a work that is done together in between, again, civil society, businesses, and the government. Just one thing about what can civil society do to promote access. Again, I would look at the example of Kenya, because I think that the civil society in Kenya had a huge role in the way the ecosystem was built there. But I would also look at the fact that we need to simplify our language and the way we're discussing those issues a little bit. Sometimes it's a bit, I work with civil society a lot and with, again, small organizations that are interested in the issues, that want to have a say in the issues, and still, you come to conferences like this, and yesterday I was at the, secure hosting workshop, and I couldn't understand half of the discussion that was going on, because it was extremely technical. And also what we were asking, NGOs to set up, to have a secure connection or to, bypass government control and so on. It's still high-level technology. What I would like to see in, maybe tomorrow is the one-click secure internet solution. I click on one thing, I download it on my computer, now I can go online safely, and I don't have to think about installing 10 different softwares and looking at 10 different types of protocols and kind of like study for 1 year what it means to actually build a secure network for my organization, because again, people don't have that type of availability right now. It costs money in terms of human resources and time. So I think that there is a role for, we'll not say just the civil society, but there is a role for the Freedom Online community and the open source community and the technical community that is helping to create those cheap solutions, to make those solutions easy. The fact that a solution is free in terms that it doesn't cost any money for me to buy doesn't mean that it's actually accessible.
I just want to add a point about the digital security part, which is like many organizations or many, let's say, community when they first get access to the internet, the first policy that many organizations push is being secure online. Before understanding the technology, before knowing how to use the internet, before knowing why they're using the internet, the first thing they get introduced to is the digital security, which is a very tough subject that needs a lot of days and years so people can understand it. So I totally agree with your point, which is people just talk a lot about digital security, very technical words that nobody really understands in the local communities. I wanna add on 2 points that were discussed, like, well, how civil society can promote to better policy. I think there's civil society, if it exists in many countries, it's either affiliated already with the government, like the wife of this minister who's working on this topic, the son of this president. So there's a lot of civil society groups that they're already affiliated with the government, and there's a kind of civil society that they are on the activism side. So they kind of like 180% degree opposite of each other. So I think in terms of policy, if civil society want to really push to a better policy, we need to kind of like have a deal with the devil. Like we need to start talking to government on a more in a more serious way. We need to be more diplomatic in our relation with the government. So the government, in their turn, they will start listening to what the civil society wants for the better of the community, of course. And another point I want to add for the question about the local language. Somebody asked about the Arabic language. I think Creative Commons are doing great work in our region, and we are also part of the community in Lebanon. And I know there's been a lot of translation from English to Arabic or opening content, Arabic content to read. But like when I'm really mentioning content, I mean like how can we really make more Arab users creators of content? Like how can we have education system that really have new generations of people who end up creating more content online? It's not like books for Mutanabbi or like old poets or like books so people can read online. Nobody really reads online. Like it's really hard for the new generation to read online. Everybody's watching YouTube, everybody reading tweet, everybody looking at pictures, looking at Instagram. It's really the way to bring Arab context to the internet. That's what really means the online content, basically.
Thank you very much. I'll just close with a few words. I think the time we've had is quite insufficient to get really to the hearts of many of the problems that were laid out and to discuss some of the solutions that were mentioned in passing in greater depth. That's quite unfortunate. This is something that deserves a conference all by itself, if you ask me. But we've touched everything from issues of technology to issues of content to that of marginalized communities to issues of just plain governance. And I think we've done a fair job of that. I'll just leave the audience with one story. While we were talking about access and affordability, there is a website in the US called Bookshare, bookshare.org, which provides access to persons with disabilities, including persons with visual impairment. Now, all of us one day will belong to that category as we age, so it is an issue that affects all of us, right? And very unfortunately, because of the way the laws are set up in the world right now, this online community, and there was also a community called Inclusive Planet, which was based out of which was created by some friends of ours in Bangalore, and they also allowed a peer-to-peer sharing community for blind people to share books amongst each other. Because blind people in a country like India have access to less than 0.5% of what sighted people have access to. And that's a very hopeful higher limit estimate. And right now there's a treaty being negotiated through the aegis of the UN body dealing with copyright called WIPO. And actually the final conference for that is starting today in Marrakesh. And while we're talking about the internet, something like this really, I think, shows what we're talking about. That blind people can have access to books, okay, by themselves through the internet, but there are lots of impediments on the way, right from accessing the internet all the way to the laws of copyright actually allowing for cross-boundary transfer of books, right? And I hope that we don't that we're able to keep this holistic picture, as Sophie painted it, in mind while we're continuing discussions around this theme through the rest of today and tomorrow. And could we have a round of applause for the panelists, please? Thank you.
I'll just leave these here.
Yeah.